Hello. Thanks for being with us. Today, I'd like to talk about animals. I know it doesn't make much sense to start with, but let's start out with a scripture in James chapter 1 and see if we can answer the question, are you a clean animal? It says in verse 13, "Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, neither does he tempt any man." I'd like to draw your attention to the last phrase, neither does he tempt any man. This is a fundamental truth. God does not tempt. I don't think there is anyone who believes otherwise. So if you believe that God would never tempt anyone to do anything wrong, then you have a basis by which you can determine the truth concerning another portion of Scripture. Let's go there. Look in Acts chapter 10, where we find Peter at the house of Cornelius. If you're familiar with this portion of Scripture, you know that Cornelius was a Gentile, which incidentally means a non-Jewish person. Gentile is a term which designates anyone who was not under the label of God's chosen people, the Israelites. Focus your attention on Peter's experience on the rooftop when he fell into a trance and saw a sheet coming down from heaven filled with all manner of animals, both clean and unclean. For those of you who are not familiar with the concept of an unclean animal, under the law of commandments there were some animals that an Israelite could not eat. They were considered unclean if they did not both chew their cud and have a split hoof. But God spoke to Peter and said, "Rise and eat." At this time, the Jews who had accepted Jesus Christ were still learning the concepts between the old law of commandments and the new law of grace. Peter was still under the assumption that it was wrong to eat animals if they didn't both ruminate and have a split hoof. Now, if it was still a sin for Peter to eat those animals, then God would have been tempting Peter to do something wrong. After reading James 1:13, which said, "Neither does he tempt any man," we must come to the conclusion that it was no longer wrong to eat animals that did not ruminate and have a split hoof. Otherwise, it would be a clear incident of God tempting man. And we know this is impossible. The reason God told Peter to rise and eat the unclean animals was because the animals which were designated as unclean represented a class of people who were unacceptable to God. The unclean animals were representative of all those nations who were not Jews and therefore not under the covenant with God. But the law of commandments had been brought to the conclusion of its purpose, for Jesus had fulfilled it. The Gentiles were now allowed to come to God through Jesus Christ. The unclean animals were no longer to be shunned. So we have another question. Why was the commandment to abstain from certain meats given in the first place? There are many who say that the reason God originally gave these commandments was for health reasons and claim that eating certain kinds of meat or eating meat at all is bad for you. But notice in 1 Kings 17:4 that God is speaking to Elijah and tells him that he has commanded the ravens to feed him. In verse 6 we see that the ravens brought him bread and flesh. If God did not want man to eat flesh, then why would God specifically provide flesh to Elijah? My conclusion is that God never does anything wrong. Therefore, the eating of flesh is acceptable to God.